Okay, so we're talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These are the key underpinnings to the web. That's what your browser is going to accept when you make a request to a web page. And so this is the second part. In the first part, we talked about the very basics of HTML elements and the principles of CSS. So now what we're moving on to is looking at stuff like images. We're looking at some more advanced styling and layout, and we're going to also move on into some JavaScript in a little while. So, all right. So for right now, let's take a look at our little code sandbox where it's based on what we did in the last time, but we've added a few things. So let's take a look at the image tag. Right now, as you can see, we have a few images, and so let's see what we're doing to get those on the page. The image tag that we're seeing, each of these is a child element of the article element that they're nested in, and the image img tag has a few key properties. So the src is the source of the image. In this case, these are images that are live on the web on websites of mine. It's also possible to have images in the local directory that the HTML is in. And then the alt tag is very important for accessibility, where you describe your image. And then you can put ID and class on them to create selectors, if you want. And that is how an image tag is put in HTML. So let's take a look at how we are using this selector of image ID parent and image ID bread to set them up to only have the width of 45 view width, so that as you can see, they're only taking up about 45% of the screen. Now, if we want to lay out images differently, we want to look at what elements that they have around them. So they each have an article element that they're the child element of. Each of these article elements is nested inside this section with class image. So section is pretty interchangeable with div. It's a HTML5 semantic tag. So if we have this, like, we're going to take a look at the display property. Now, they're up and down because inside section class image, each of these child elements, the article element here, by default they actually have display property of block. We can show you that by, well, let's just eliminate it. Let's save that. It's going to behave the same way because that's the default behavior of an article element. And the important thing to remember with these layout properties is that the display property typically affects the direct child element, not the actual element that the property is being put on. So, for example, let's say we can put on the flex property. Now, we save that and refresh the screen, and you see it actually goes left-right. Now, Flexbox is another way to lay out, and its default is left-right, although it can actually be changed with a property called flex direction. So I think if we were to say vertical with that, but I could actually have to look up the property name. What is the flex direction property? Row. Okay, so it actually uses the concept of row or column.
So if we are actually going to change that right now, flex direction is in a row, but if we modify it to column, it'll be like that. So as you can see, the flex display property has complementary properties, a number of other ones along with flex direction that can modify its behavior. So in a way that isn't the exact opposite of that block. The opposite of block is inline. So if we say inline, once we get that left-right behavior again, but just by changing the... Now, again, this is because this one would have to be selected directly. Now, that's just the way that those are different. If you're using flex, then the child properties are the ones that are affected. If you're using the block and inline difference, then you actually have to specify, more specifically in that case. So, taking a look at moving images around, and now let's say we, because each of these is selecting this article, let's add something like padding. Now, do we have something that there are newer properties other than, so instead of something like padding bottom, you could say padding block end. Now, typically, if you're using an up-down orientation, but I mean, for simplicity now, we're just going to say padding bottom, and we're going to say maybe like 10 pixels. Now, we're not going to see if it's white on white, it's not going to matter, but we can change, of course. And the color pickers are often in search engines very quickly and easy to get to. So if we want, like, let's get a nice little kind of cyberpunk pink kind of color or something like that, and then go in there. Now we're going to actually see a background around. So because we've put padding in the bottom, we can remove this input element. It's not really doing too much. Because we see, let's give that top bar a different, nice like light blue color or something. So that thing even has a color picker built into it. So the bottom has the padding, so it actually has is showing the background. Now, if we added padding to the right side, spelled it correctly, then we should, although obviously not getting anything to show up. So now that we've actually added some of these, we can add something like border radius. And what that'll do is that gives us the classic rounded corners. So as you can see, because the article is so small, it's one of those like the dimension curled in on itself kind of situation. What we got to do is we got to give it a height property, right? So give like, and obviously we want to spell that right also. And so let's say 40% of the viewport height. I don't know why that thing is not happy. Alright, because we're using inline, what we want to do is let's move back to using a flex container, because there are a lot of implications of using these different. So now all we need to try to do is figure out like why the image section actually it needs to be refreshed, obviously. Okay, so now it's not even exactly tall enough, but it's getting close. So we can save that. Okay, so now as you can see we have this layout of sorts. Now these things are probably too big because we were all right, maybe not. But now that we've done some really crude CSS layout, as you can see, this is probably a good time to talk about how a lot of people like CSS frameworks. There are things like Bootstrap and Foundation and Tailwind where they have either CSS that you can add a class and you add a bunch of CSS to your project from them and then use their classes to specify things, or even they'll put default styling on divs and sections in some of these frameworks, and then you have a certain kind of like look. So that's popular for a lot of business applications. Now, responsive design is very important because if we are looking at a website where it's gonna be viewed on mobile as well, we have to consider like, well, it has to act differently, right? So in this case, this site changes a bit. So these sites where these sections here where they're normally left, right, they go up, down when you go to a certain... So what decides when that changes? And that's actually something called a media query. So media queries can take the form of something like that, where you're looking at any CSS, as long as the width of the screen is this way and the orientation is such, all the CSS in here should run. So that is one of the main patterns used for responsive design. So let's take a look at our page here now. JavaScript is important. We've done all this with CSS and HTML. So what do we use JavaScript for? Now, JavaScript is really key for adding interactivity to the page. JavaScript has become an application framework, which is it's very important for actually for a lot of modern programs run as apps. But let's consider like the way that the HTML is actually laid out with JavaScript is in JavaScript known as the document object model, or the DOM. So that is the abstraction that is used to interact with the actual content. So why do we want to do that? Well, if we need a programming language to do something like go out on the web and get an update from an API, we actually want to use something that will actually be able to update the DOM. So JavaScript is the only thing that works for that on web pages. So with JavaScript, it's very important to consider timing. There isn't any main method. There are new ways to instantiate variables. There are class keywords for data structures. So let's take a look really quick at something like where we're making a query here to the Open Weather Map API. Here we're getting this data. So what if we grab the code? See, we actually have this in JavaScript. So let's grab this code right here. Let's go to our page. And then let's add a script tag, because if we want to have JavaScript run on our page, it runs under the HTML object. So let's add script. And at this point, it should be going and getting our weather report.